Okay, we have a few more people coming in. So the CHS has a new exhibition entitled Common Struggle, Individual Experience, an exhibition about mental health presented by Hartford Healthcare Institute of Living. And we have several programs planned related to this exhibition and the topic of mental health. So today's presentation is on the topic of mental health and religion in the 19th century. And Dr. Alexandra Prince's presentation is entitled The Barbed Arrow of Insanity, Debating the Boundaries Between Mental Pathology and Religion. Dr. Prince holds a PhD in history from the University at Buffalo. Their research examines the cultural history of American religions and the social study of madness. And currently they are an adjunct professor at Skidmore College in upstate New York and director of operations at the Mountaintop Historical Society. Very busy person. Well, welcome, Dr. Prince. Please take it away.
Very good. Thank you so much for everybody for being present today. And thank you to Jen Busa for organizing this and for Eileen Frank for, I'm assuming, recommending me as a speaker for this wonderful series. I look forward so much to visiting this exhibit in person soon. So I'm going to share my screen and I'll get started. Okay, so as Jen mentioned, the title of my presentation is The Barbed Arrow of Insanity, and that's a phrase that I borrowed from a person who was committed against their will at an insane asylum. And I'm gonna, instead of explaining it right now, I'm instead going to have you all sort of deduce throughout my presentation today what I might mean by that, and we can circle back around to it at the end if we need any clarification. The way I've structured an overview of today's talk is just through a series of questions. So today we're going to be talking about the relationship between religion and madness, and through the lens of this disease category that was known as religious insanity in the 19th century. So we're going to be looking at what was religious insanity, who came up with the idea, how was it spread, and what was the cultural effect. We'll also look at which religious groups and individuals were labeled as insane, were diagnosed as having religious insanity, and why, the impact of gender and race, and how that was embedded and impacted assessments of religious insanity. And importantly, we'll also be looking at how religious groups and individuals challenge these assessments, how they push back or talk back against critics, both in the press and in the medical profession. And finally, we'll be looking a little bit at the end to why this is an important historical narrative to understand and why it's relevant today. Before I proceed, I want to just be transparent about my approach as a scholar and the way I interpret some of the materials that I'll be discussing today. So I'm mainly premised in a MAD studies perspective, and MAD studies is a newer disciplinary approach that came out of the ex-survivor patient movement of the 1960s. So these were folks who had been institutionalized in the middle part of the 20th century, later part of the 20th century, and they contested their institutionalization and they contested their medical labeling as insane. And instead they led a collective effort to challenge saneism, which I define as discrimination or bias based on perceived mental inability or ability. And from a MAD studies perspective, you'll notice that I'm not coming from a typical history of medicine approach or history of religion approach, because what I'm going to be doing is privileging the perspectives of those who have been labeled insane versus those who have historically had the power to label others as insane, and that would predominantly be those of the medical profession. Finally, why am I saying mad or madness? Why am I using this term insanity in my title? I'm also going to use the term lunatic. Why am I not saying mental illness or health, like the term that's being used in the exhibit at the Historical Society? And the reason I'm using mad or madness is because this has been a term that's been reclaimed by mad scholars and mad activists in an effort to try to drive away the narrow derogative association that people have with the term mad, and instead understand it as in a more multiplicitous way, as not only something that's negative, but also something that can be positive. And then in terms of why I'm not saying mental illness or health, that's easier. The focus of today's talk is the 19th century and a bit into the turn of the 20th. And the terms mental illness and mental health did not yet exist at the time we're looking at today. So I'd like to begin with a story. This is the story of Mrs. Elizabeth Houston, and we learn about her in various newspaper accounts that were published in 1841. Elizabeth Houston was a mother, she was a wife, and she was described as a beautiful Irish woman. That was, unfortunately, until she came to attend one day a Baptist revival. And when she attended this Baptist revival, we learned that she met a preacher, and that the preacher at the revival convinced her that of her inherent sinfulness and her pending torment in the afterlife. So we learned too that Houston became so consumed with grief, so depressed, that she fell into a deep depression, and she started to exhibit signs of what people were calling religious anxiety. She reportedly feared that in her depressed state, she might even hurt her children. So she asked her husband to commit her to the Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island in New York City. Now, understanding Mrs. Houston's story is important for a couple reasons. One, we learn that there's this idea that she suffers from a disease that we no longer have today, religious insanity, also termed as religious anxiety. But the end of her story also points to larger trends that were common at the time within depictions of religious insanity. In fact, we learn that Mrs. Houston, unfortunately, one day stole a razor blade from the top of the mantle in her home, and she then picked up her Bible and locked herself in her room. And that after failed attempts at knocking and even eventually breaking down the door, her husband couldn't get to her, but eventually once he did, he unfortunately discovered his wife had taken her own life. So readers of this story were led to believe that this was the fruit of modern revivals, that people who attended evangelical revivals at this time, like Mrs. Houston, could fall victim to a form of madness known as religious excitement. And I also think Houston's story is instructive because it encompasses several facets of what I see as this very typical kind of archetypal story of the woman who falls victim to religious insanity, such as the white female as victim, the suggestion that her involvement with evangelical revivalism caused her decay in her role as wife and mother, and that her religious involvement had a direct effect on her tragic death. So one of my goals today is to demonstrate to you that these insanity charges, that this understanding of religious insanity in the 19th century, it wasn't just about mental disease or illness or madness, but in fact, these charges of insanity signaled larger cultural discontent with issues such as women's participation in religious revivals and religion more broadly, fears about the decay of the domestic sphere, and anxiety regarding the evolving religious landscape in the country at the time. Stepping back a bit here and just examining what this term religious insanity is and where it's coming from. So the most basic understanding of what religious insanity is that it's a disease label or the name of a disease that was created within early psychiatry in the beginning of the 19th century. But to more fully understand the cultural context in which it arose, we have to look at three different factors. The first factor is, as you might presume, the backdrop of evangelical revivalism and the proliferation of different religious movements and identities throughout the 19th century. Second crucial aspect of this, how did we learn about Mrs. Houston's story in so many newspapers? Because there was a revolution, scholars say, of the American presses, which had to do with an increase in the number of dailies, weeklies, monthly publications, pamphlets, all variety and manner of publication within a society that was highly literate and had practically an insatiable appetite for the written word. And third, we can look at the rise of asylum medicine and medical interpretations of religion for better understanding how conceptions of religious insanity were formed. Here I want to dive into a few of these factors, and the first is that of evangelical revivalism, and to understand what this background, how this background affected the shaping and construction of religious insanity. So Mrs. Houston, it was said that she attended a Baptist revival, and evangelical revivals were very popular throughout the 19th century and preceding that. And many people were alarmed at how the once small evangelical sects of Methodists and Baptists were swelling with new adherents. And most new adherents to these sects were garnered through attendance at revivals. And you can see in this image that this is not your typical spiritual gathering at the time. These folks are not inside a church or a building, but in fact, they've gathered outside under the canopy of trees, and they're in fact staying here overnight. You can see that there are tents in the background here, because these revivals, they wouldn't just last a few hours or a few days. Some of them could last several weeks. And the kinds of behaviors that were exhibited at these revivals were highly emotional, highly physical. You can see this woman has her hands up in the air. There's the other women who also look like they're having an emotional response, either to what the preacher is saying or to what these women are exhibiting in terms of their spiritual conviction and conversion experience in front of them. So there were a lot of people who were observing these revivals and the methods of the preachers that were being used to convert people, and they were highly critical of these spaces. The next backdrop to dive more deeply into is what I referred to as the revolution of American presses. These are just some of the Boston Daily Times was one of the most highly circulating daily newspapers at the time. And this idea that you could have a newspaper published on a daily basis and have it sold for a reasonable amount of money that a common person could afford, that also was part of the revolution that got word out about about revivalism and about some of the so-called ill effects that could be met by those who participated in them. And then to give you a sense of how just every community in the United States really had their own voice in publication, I have here an example of the Meteor, which was printed, published, edited, and entirely run by inmates of the Alabama Insane Hospital in Tuscaloosa in the later part of the 19th century. And there was another newspaper like this that was published at the Utica State Asylum called the Opal. And while both of those, they didn't rely on the kind of sensationalism that the Boston Daily Times would have, they nonetheless also discussed the phenomenon of revivalism, and the inmates who published and wrote, they had their own perspectives on whether or not revivalism was a good trend in religion or a bad one. Finally, we come to the origin of where medical insanity and medical ideas for the relationship between religion and madness were sourced from. In the late 18th and early 19th century, there had been a dramatic shift in understandings of madness. It had used to be the case that people who suffered from madness were believed to be suffering from supernatural causes that couldn't be treated. But with the rise of early psychiatry, there were new theories that stated that in fact, madness or insanity was a somatic or physical condition of mental disease, and that given the right environment, people could yield to treatment and could recover from insanity. So the early field of psychiatry was born out of asylum medicine, and early psychiatrists functioned as superintendents of asylums. They were also known as alienists. And so the roots of psychiatry and disease labeling, understandings of mental disease and functions of the mind, this all can be traced back to the institution of insane asylums in the United States. This is another example of one of the more famous institutions that was built in Buffalo, the Buffalo State Lunatic Asylum, which was opened in 1880. And you can get a sense of just how large these institutions were and the hundreds of people that they housed. This one was also a famous one because it was of Olmsted construction and design. A view inside the Buffalo State Lunatic Asylum. This is a hallway off of one of the main wards, showing some of the inmates or patients present at the time. So importantly, I don't want to give the sense that superintendents were against religion. They certainly weren't against religion, but they were against the trends in religion that they were witnessing in the reports of revivalism in newspapers. When you start to look at the other major way that superintendents of asylums were interacting with this idea of religious insanity is that they were starting to classify the causes of insanity, and they would publish these in their annual reports. And this is the annual report of the officers of the retreat for the insane at Hartford, so nearby the Historical Society, that was published in 1844. And this was a record of all the probable causes of insanity of all the inmates or patients that had been admitted since the opening of an institution 20 years earlier. So since it had opened 20 years earlier, it had admitted just over 1,300 people. And you can see immediately that anybody looking at this chart would notice that religious anxiety or a madness related to religious causes was one of the leading probable causes of insanity among all the inmates or patients at this institution. Now, it's important to understand too that this kind of chart would not only have been read by the superintendent or the officers of the retreat, but this kind of chart would have been republished in census statistics, and it would have also been read by commentators in the press. So commentators in the press who already had a grudge against evangelical revivalism, they would look at a chart like this and they would say, see, I don't just have a personal grudge against revivalist tendencies. I can show you actual scientific data that proves that religion is a cause of anxiety. And certainly there are a lot of people, when they look at this, they see loss of friends, disappointed affection, or masturbation. And there's sort of a chuckle about, oh, how could they have thought that these were the causes of insanity? But 2 points to that. One is that these are the causes of insanity that were cited by the members of the family or friends who admitted inmates or patients. So it wasn't necessarily the doctor or the superintendent's assessment of their insanity. It was upon them entering the institution, what did the person who was committing them say that they were suffering from? So all the people who were admitted for religious anxiety, the friends and family members who committed them, sometimes and often against their will, said that something to do with their madness had to do with religious anxiety, or likely their participation in revivalism. And I noted here at the top that religious insanity, I've been going back and forth between religious insanity and religious anxiety, you see here below. Religious insanity, to be clear, is the umbrella term. And underneath that, there are all different iterations of how this disease could manifest. So it could manifest in a so-called manic form as religious anxiety, or it could manifest in the depressed state, which was known as religious melancholia. This is another chart from the state lunatic asylum at Utica in a similar year in 1844. And you can see this is even more pronounced, how prominent religion was in the supposed causes of insanity at this time. Religious anxiety in this chart is actually at the very top. You can see it's more or less evenly spread among men and women. But if you look further down, and I have it in the rectangle here, we have Millerism. And Millerism was another new religion that was related to revivalism and was a form of evangelical revivalism itself, but it was noted separately. So Millerism combined with religious insanity, religious anxiety, means that the supposed causes associated with religion were even higher than this specific chart gives the suggestion of. Now, again, to be clear, the asylum was predicated on the Christian treatment of insane patients. And the main philosophy guiding the construction of insane asylums and guiding the care for patients was a religious philosophy called moral therapy. And the doctors themselves were Protestant Christians, and they regularly appealed to their Christian identity to give authority to their profession as doctors. So they certainly weren't against religion, but they were against the kind of religion, the kind of highly emotional, highly physical environments that evangelical revivalism was fostering. And this is another one, probably the most famous image of a revivalist preacher, and you can see that his hand is up, and he has obvious power over all these people who are falling over or swooning, overtaken by their emotions such that they can no longer sit fully. And again, the backdrop being one that's outside, so this is not a typical religious space that can be controlled. People here are mingling of different genders. This image does not show it, but many early revivals were also interracial, which only fed to criticism of this environment. And as evidence too that they didn't have an issue more broadly with religion, and to them certainly religion only meant Protestant Christianity. In fact, we see evidence of the use of religion as a form of therapy among asylum inmates. This is an example from the Buffalo State Lunatic Asylum Chapel. So every lunatic asylum that was built had to have a chapel. In fact, the guidelines for building insane asylums all included instructions on where to fashion the chapel, how many pews there should be, and also every lunatic asylum or insane asylum either employed a full-time chaplain to lead religious services or had a visiting chaplain. Coming back here, that's the one that we saw before. Coming to a story from Brother Jonathan. And Brother Jonathan was one of the most highly circulated publications. It was published out of New York City. And so stories that appeared in publications like Brother Jonathan, they would refer back to charts such as the supposed causes of madness, to use them as evidence that their stories were true. And the kind of stories that were published in Brother Jonathan, they're very much akin to the story that I introduced in the beginning about Mrs. Houston. They spoke of very sensationalist stories involving murder, involving the murder of children, and involving behavior today that we would certainly call religious fanaticism. So in 1841, Brother Jonathan published a story about a man named Morningstar, and he lived in Upper Canada, which is what we today call Ontario. And purportedly, Morningstar drowned his 9-year-old child in Lake Erie, and then he also attempted to drown his wife and a second child, but they were able to escape. The Brother Jonathan, the reporters claimed that Morningstar believed that the murders would get him to heaven. A similar case occurred in Talladega, Alabama in the same year, whereby a man named Rodern murdered his son in a fit of religious insanity. He then took the body, piled wood and rails upon it, and set the pile ablaze as a burnt offering to heaven. I think you have a sense, just with these two brief stories, of the kind of reporting on religious insanity that was circulating at the time. And to reiterate it one more time, they would look to the asylum statistics that they had seen published in newspapers and the census to justify the truth of these stories. And it's easy, I think, to imagine how alarming such reports would have been to readers, and whether or not the details were exactly true, and whether or not the acts of violence were directly instigated by religious beliefs or practices, that's difficult to determine. But what about the actual experience of people who were labeled insane because of their religion, but denied that they were insane? What about people who were committed to insane asylums against their will, as many were, for practicing their religion, or who the press were convinced were suffering from an insane delusion, but according to them, they were simply practicing their religious beliefs? So to explore these questions, I have 3 different case studies, the first of which is Elizabeth Stone. In 1842, Stone was a factory worker in Lowell, Massachusetts, and she was also a student. And she was tricked by her brother, who told her that he was going to admit her to a young lady's boarding house, but in fact, he tricked her and committed her to the Charleston McLean Asylum in Massachusetts. The cause for the commitment was that the brother found his sister so insufferable because she had recently converted to a new religion called Millerism. Inside the asylum, we know from a memoir that Stone wrote that physicians there made her take, against her will, certain, quote, medicines, and that she thought were purposed to subvert her religious sense. She sought out, she knew that one of the asylum physicians at McLean was a Congregationalist, and she thought, oh, this is good. He'll be a good Christian man, and he'll understand my predicament as just a woman of faith who's trying to practice my religion. But instead, she was only rebuked by him. She was told she misunderstood the Bible. She was laughed at, and she was told that she shouldn't believe that she was so full of the Spirit or be confident about her religious identity as she was. So depressed in this position, unable to free herself, she's being kept against her will. She attempts to take her own life. The staff responds by restraining her with a leather muff, which was an unfortunate physical restraint that was commonly used in asylums. She was also forced to take cold showers to stop her weeping. In her memoirs, Closing Remarks to Christians, which Stone published in 1846, she writes that this was not just about her experience, but in fact a warning to the readers. You are liable yet to have the cry raised about you, that you are insane, and to be taken and imprisoned as I have been, where violence is used to force medicine down your throat, which kills or destroys the Spirit of Christ in you. Now, Stone was, as I said, a Millerite, which was a movement that was a predecessor to the present-day Seventh-day Adventist movement. In the late 1830s, tens of thousands of Americans, and that's a conservative estimate, probably many more, believed they were living on the eve of the Judgment Day or the second coming of Christ. Millerites were also known as Second Adventists, and they were followers of the preacher William Miller, who had predicted the exact time that Jesus would return to the world and that a new spiritual age would begin. Now, Millerites attracted a wide variety of denunciations, but the idea that they were insane or mad, that the number of their adherents were filling up asylums, followed them throughout their rise and decline. In addition to these sensationalist reports, Second Adventists were charged with causing young women and children to go insane as well, and to leave their families and children. Adventists, before I continue, I just want to review a few of these just wonderful graphics that were printed by the Millerites or the Second Adventists. So what we see here is a graphic representation of the way in which William Miller and his followers would have understood how to identify the year 1843 and later 1844 as the precise return of Christ here. And what it was what I call a form of Bible math, so to speak, which was looking at the visions that were contained in the book of Daniel and marrying those with assessments and descriptions in the book of Revelations, mapping those onto actual historical and political events, and then through a kind of math, arriving at certain years. And this is another image that was published by the Second Adventists. It was a large, very large broadside that would have been posted in public places at the time. Now, because they had so specifically identified the return of Christ, now that idea that Christ would return, that was a common one at the time, but to actually identify the time and to make actual preparations to leave this world and ascend into heaven, now that was met with a strong rebuke. And you can imagine the kind of sensationalist reports that were published in ridiculing Millerites for believing this. And this is one of the examples of a satirical broadside or poster, which is ridiculing this idea that the Millerites are going to be ascended into heaven. Adventists were also ridiculed for their preparations for the end times. They were said to have that many people sold all of their belongings, that they stopped going to work. They left crops unharvested in their fields. And these activities gave further fuel to the flame of criticism that Millerism was really nothing more than a mass delusion. And here we have another satirical cartoon making fun of a Millerite who has, all of his wares packed up in this what's called a salamander safe, waiting for the second advent of Christ. And this is a more early 20th century representation of Millerites. And this is probably one of the longest, most enduring stereotypes of Millerites, which is this idea that they actually got rid of their normal clothes and swapped them for white Muslim, so-called ascension robes. This idea that they donned these robes was reported in several newspapers, including the New York Evangelist. One family in Albany, New York, reportedly dressed themselves in these long white robes and with white slippers on their feet, and just instead of working, sat all day long in patient yet confident expectation of the end of all earthly things. In another circulated story, a formerly affectionate mother and wife had become yet another victim of insanity. She was described as a raving maniac. The woman reportedly had attended a series of Millerite meetings in Cleveland. Afterwards, she was said to be found lining up her 5 children side by side, instructing each one of them to keep their eyes to the skies for Christ's arrival. The authors of this critical article wrote, "She has since attempted to take their lives, and instead of kisses and caresses which they were wont to share, they are now obliged to flee her fiendish grasp." Apparently, according to these accounts, Millerism had the power to convert a mother's loving embrace into the grip of murder. So such accounts not only depicted Millerites as deluded and prone to insanity, but cast them off as unproductive members of society who threatened local economies and were harmful to children's safety. Now, it wasn't a one-way street, this conversation. It wasn't as if doctors and critics in the press had these assessments that members of the Millerite movement were the products of insanity and had insane minds, and published them in their medical reports and their newspapers. But in fact, Second Adventists or Millerites, they had their own publications. And one of their major publications was the Signs of the Times. And they used their own publications, including Signs of the Times, and another notable one is the Midnight Cry, to deride this idea that their religion was really more of a public health issue than a true faith. And they also responded in force to this idea that members of Millerism had been committed to insane asylums. They would go to those insane asylums and interview the superintendents and say, "How many Millerites do you really have here?" And they would republish their findings in letters to the editors of people who had penned critical letters. So they would work to expose the injustice of this coverage more broadly, and they also challenged their critics to produce evidence of hearsay cases. And again, and this is a current that runs through all of the diverse religious groups that had been accused of precipitating insanity, they asserted that their doctrines and that their practices, rather than causing insanity, were in fact a cure. And to this end, Adventists published insanity recovery stories. Adventists also questioned the very basis of medical interpretations of insanity. They contended that this presumed connection between asylum commitments and insanity was actually quite misleading if one considered the actual dynamics of insanity commitments in the United States at the time. To this end, one Adventist author for the Adventist newspaper, The Signs of the Times, wrote, "It should be remembered that to be found within an asylum of the insane is no proof of insanity. Friends have only to report a friend insane and get the opinion of a physician to that effect, and they have power to incarcerate them according to their own pleasure in any insane hospital and for any length of time they please. Only a difference of opinion is often called insanity." And now I'd like to look at one final case study here, which was another wave of revivalism that occurred decades later at the turn of the 20th century. This was the period of the birth of the Pentecostal revivalism that took place across the country, but one of the centers was in Los Angeles. Now, Pentecostalism had its roots in 19th century holiness movement, which was a charismatic Christian tradition that emphasized biblical inerrancy, faith healing, this idea of progressive sanctification or experiencing a spiritual rebirth, and certainly a focus on the so-called gifts of the Holy Spirit, in particular, speaking in tongues. In Los Angeles, the main arena of revivalist activity took place in the building you see in front of you, which was a former African Methodist Episcopal church, a church. Hundreds experienced conversion and sanctification, and they were converted and, quote, baptized with the Holy Ghost into the new faith. A new convert, George Berg, attended one of the early revival meetings here and reported the following. The Holy Ghost fell on me like balls of fire and went through me from the crown of my head to the soles of my feet. The Spirit flooded my whole being and enlarged my heart till I was afraid the vessel might not hold the glory and power that seemed to rush into me like water poured out. Before I realized it, the Spirit got hold of my tongue and used it for the glory of God in speaking in an unknown tongue. So he's referring to what we call today glossolalia, or speaking in tongues. So in the context of the early Azusa Street revivals, this would mean speaking in an unknown language entirely, or speaking in a language that the speaker had theretofore not been knowledgeable of. Religious hopefuls during these early Pentecostal revivals were guided by William J. Seymour. He was a Black holiness preacher who had been raised in Louisiana by formerly emancipated slaves. Seymour was also regularly aided by visiting preachers who were both white and Black from across the country. He expounded on the importance of experiencing these biblical gifts, such as speaking in tongues, and he also promoted racial equality. So many hundreds of men and women of all races, all ages, they gathered together for these Pentecostal revivals in Los Angeles at the time, that it soon became known to all the neighbors that there was really something happening on Azusa Street. And we predict today that there weren't hundreds, but perhaps thousands and even tens of thousands of people had been converted over the many years that this revival took place. The meetings were notable not only for the emotionality and physicality, but their racial, gendered, class, and ethnic diversity, an aspect of the new religious movement that was widely regarded with suspicion by outsider critics in the press, as you might imagine. So some of the earliest coverage of the Azusa Street revival simply just reviled them because they said that they were a public disturbance. But very soon after, when they started to understand better the demographic makeup of these revivalists, they moved on to assessing them according to race and their mental state, undergirding and reinforcing the press's critiques of the interracial makeup of these meetings were assessments of their mental state. These people appear to be mad, mentally deranged, or under a spell, reported the Los Angeles Times. The interracial worshipers were said to be working themselves into a state of mad excitement. According to one physician who published a piece in the Los Angeles Times, he reported that the members were ranting and dancing, rolling in a disgusting amalgamation of African voodoo superstition and Caucasian insanity, and will pass away like the hysterical nightmares that they are. So in looking at these assessments of what happened in early Pentecostalism, it almost seems as if they could not publish one line that ridiculed and criticized the revivalists without referring to the language of mental pathology. The press further played into fears of racial integration and the resentment of Black spiritual authority by coupling their assessments of religious insanity with the suggestion that, in fact, Pentecostal meetings were a cover for indecent associations between Black men and white women. For instance, white women who kissed and hugged the Black pastor, R.A. Garrison, behaved in such a manner that would, quote, put the insane asylum to shame. Black men's spiritual authority over the bodies and emotions of white women evoked a deep-seated resentment of Black positions of power. I'm a little ahead here, but here in 1907, we have a major headline that was published, which was "Crazed Girls in the Arms of Black Men." The newspaper exclaimed in this headline that when a young white girl who had attended one of the Pentecostal revivals, that she lost control of herself and shouted wildly, a big Negro approached to quiet her, and that would have been referring to the Black preacher. He approached to quiet her. He placed one arm around her and drew her close to him. The girl became calmer, but as soon as he left her, again resumed her shouting. These sensationalist reports functioned to challenge and dismantle the authority of Black Pentecostal religious leaders, and they played upon historic fears of Black men as corrupters of white women's bodies and their moral purity. The religious leadership of Black men and interracial religious movements, such as early Pentecostalism, were thus positioned as a slippery slope, not only to racial integration, but moral abandonment and miscegenation. Now, Pentecostalists were widely aware that many people considered their practices, especially speaking in tongues, as fanatical or even the mark of crazy people. Again, like I said before, that this is a two-way street. They're aware of the criticism, and they, like the Millerites, they have their own publications with which to respond. One of the Pentecostal publications was the Bridegroom's Messenger, and in the Bridegroom's Messenger, there was a few articles that wrote in talking about how there's this wave of criticism against them. And one respondent, he published a lengthy list of rhetorical questions relating similar so-called eccentricities found in the Bible. And essentially what he was getting at is that everybody thinks that Pentecostals have insane or wild ideas, but in fact, they believe in many aspects of the Bible, and shouldn't they be similarly criticized if so? For instance, he wrote, was Noah a madman when he built an ark to float above mountains not yet flooded? Was Abraham's mission to establish a new religion without idol worship anything but the wildest kind of fanaticism? Writing from Canada, John Reed warned, be careful that you don't style those who are speaking in tongues as being crazy, because for Reed and for many Pentecostals, speaking in tongues was the physical validation that they were seeking, that they had been sanctified by God. So I'm coming toward the end here, and I only have a few more minutes here. So I want to be clear about what's at stake in this debate and what was happening in the background. So you can see through my discussion, I hope, that accusations of insanity, they weren't just medical assessments, they were actually very powerful cultural critiques. Charges of religious insanity could pose serious threat to members of religious communities. It could bar them from participation, which it did. It could put them liable to be attacked by not just the press, but by the police and be imprisoned, as many early Pentecostalists were. There were reports in Los Angeles of people having spiritual experiences and speaking in tongues, and the police interpreted that as a form of madness and imprisoned them. More broadly, though, insanity conferred associations of irrationality, of instability, and disease. So to label somebody who is a religious believer as insane is a challenge against their personhood in the widest sense. It could strip people of their legal rights by committing them against their will to insane asylums. It could which would then effectively take them away from their families and children, but it could also deny individuals and communities their rights to religious knowledge, their religious experiences, and their own memories and histories. It led women who disagreed with their husbands or families to be institutionalized against their will. And this label of insanity, it would stick with people. So the Millerites, who were described in the 1830s and 40s as being insane, as donning those white muslin hoods that we saw in that cartoon, that's still a dominant interpretation of the Millerite movement, or it was until very recently, when scholars of religion and particularly Second Adventists began to challenge it. So that's how deeply ingrained these reductionistic perspectives can become, not only within medical literature, but popular cultural assessments as well. But looking too at the fact that people who belong to newest religious movements, they didn't sit idly by and be labeled as insane without challenging these assessments. They actively work to divest themselves of this association. They work to investigate spurious claims of insanity charges and asylum commitments. Like I said, among the Millerites, they penned letters to the editors. Many published pamphlets to clarify their beliefs and practices for the public, or hosted public lectures to bring their own perspectives about their faith, and not just have the American public rely upon what the sensationalist reports that they were reading in the media consistently throughout the century. And most importantly, as I stated before, they continually argued that their faith was a cure rather than a cause of insanity. And in instances too, when pushed to their wits' end, certain members of religious communities claimed madness. And one member of the Christian Scientists movement that began in the 1860s, founded by Mary Baker Eddy, Septimus J. Hanna, he wrote, "Yes, it's true. We prefer the lunacy of life to the lunacy of death, the lunacy of love to the lunacy of hate, the lunacy of truth to the lunacy of error, the lunacy of health to the lunacy of disease, the lunacy of happiness to the lunacy of misery. And may God speed the day when all humanity shall be consigned to this lunatic asylum." Because for him, if they were going to continue to label himself and his fellow Christian Scientists as being insane, he was going to take up that mantle and refashion it and reclaim it as something positive for his faith. And I'll end there before going over time. And thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much,
I
Dr.
hope
Prince.
I did that effectively.
Yep, you did. That was amazing. That was really great. I just want to remind people, if you have any questions, to please put them in the chat while we're waiting for people to think and type them up. I had a quick question about, when did things start to swing in a different direction, where people were really looking at these as legitimate religions, not institutionalizing people?
Arguably, we haven't shifted. I mean, it depends on the certain religious tradition that you're speaking about, but there are a lot of stereotypes. I didn't speak about Mormonism, but members of the Latter-day Saints, they were also labeled as insane. Now, today, you might not assume that because they sort of have a mainstream status in society, but for a long time, their critics have labeled their ideas as insane. And then members of groups who had any numbers of people who ever went into insane asylums, they're still battling this kind of negative idea that their religion was a cause of insanity just because members of that faith happened to be institutionalized. And naturally, they responded that, just because members of the Catholic faith or a Protestant faith are committed, it doesn't mean that the entire religion is a source of mental disease, that the association is an unfair one. So especially when we're looking at new religious movements going through the 20th century, this is still a dominant interpretation. A lot of what I said today, I didn't say it from the outset, is really a prehistory to how the cult scares of the 60s and 70s played out, and why the language of pathology and this view that members of cults were insane or brainwashed, why there was that resort to psychological interpretations. I believe it's because we have this seasoned cultural grounding in how to interpret displays and beliefs within religions that we aren't familiar with.
Does anyone have any questions? Or you can feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat.
I saw a couple hands, but they may have disappeared.
Go ahead, Steve.
Steve.
Yes, I have a question. First of all, I enjoyed your presentation very much. My particular area of research for the last 45 years has been with the Shakers. And many of the early Shakers' religious practices were not terribly different from the Millerites. They involved in religious worship, shouting, dancing, howling, rolling on the floor, passing out, what they would call ecstatic movements. And yet I can't recall a single instance of the Shakers being committed or even recommended for incarceration in an insane asylum. Have you any response to that?
Absolutely. Well, there are a couple things. I think certainly the era of manifestations would have been the period under which they would have come under the greatest scrutiny. So that was the period when many people were experiencing visions and were acting as spiritualist mediums. And I think the difference is not that many in the Shakers were described as being insane in the press, but because those communities were self-maintained and self-governed, they wouldn't have committed members of their own community to an insane asylum. And in fact, when I tried to dig a little bit deeper into the relationship between exhibitions of supposed madness within Shaker communities, I found that they were actually very intolerant of people who had any kind of divergent mental or physical displays. So they weren't welcoming to people who had who may have, truly had manifestations of what we would today call mental disease.
Okay, just two other quick points. One is that suicide among Shakers was a constant throughout the 19th century. And the second is that after 1844, many of the former Millerites joined the Shakers, and many of those became lifelong members, faithful members for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point because, today we have such a rosy, positive perception of the Shakers. And like you pointed out, they didn't have wildly divergent ideas from the Millerites. Many Millerites, after the so-called Great Disappointment, when Jesus didn't return, they joined Shaker communities. But I think, perhaps if Millerites had structured themselves differently and maybe produce better furniture, we might have a better assessment of them today.
Amen to that.
Dr. Prince, we do have a question in the chat from Angela. She mentioned your earlier examples seem to take place during the Second Great Awakening. Could religious insanity contributed to the area of upstate New York and New England being referred to as the burned out district?
Yeah, so the area of upstate New York where spiritualism started, Mormonism started, many Shaker communities and utopian communities were located, that we refer to that as the burned over district. But that phrase comes from the fact that the land had been scorched, that there were actually so many people who had been converted that there were no more souls left to convert. And it does factor into it because the state asylum at Utica that I gave a few examples from, that was the first and largest public asylum in New York State. So there are these different waves of revivalism among Millerites and spiritualists occurred, they did see an increase in the number of people in that state asylum who were then committed by their friends or family members. So there was really a direct correlation between some of these waves and an increase in commitments.
I would like to just add on to that. One, that area is still considered the burnt over, burnt out district because it is so hard for any even established religion to maintain their membership in that area and in New England. We often refer to it even because I go to like the diocese conventions and like that, and it's referred to it that way. Could the established white English mentality have been fighting or responding back against this revivals that would cross over those lines that they had established, because it's white authority of the white male over the women, and the white culture, so we don't cross lines on racially as well. Could that have contributed to the increase in considering these people religiously insane?
Absolutely. I don't know if I can speak exactly to what a white English mentality is, but I can certainly speak to an idea about what European understandings among early Americans were of what religion was defined as and what it should be defined as. Religion in the Protestant Calvinist perception was supposed to be a calming, peaceful gathering of people. And so when revivalists among the radical evangelical sect started and said, no, in fact, we want to raise people's emotions, we want to get them physically excited so that they can accept Jesus into their heart, that was a radical departure. And that was premised upon a very interesting idea, which was that instead of this traditional understanding that you would have a lifetime of spiritual study, instead spiritual seeking to find evidence that you were going to find grace in God's eyes and go to heaven. Instead, radical evangelicals said, you don't need to spend your whole life doing that. You can be assured of God's grace in one moment. But to get to that one moment, you might have to be in an environment that's highly emotional or highly physical to kind of rouse you to that emotional point where you can actually fully accept God into your heart. And I think that was one of the major differences that they were pushing against. To your point about the patriarchal structure, absolutely. I mean, women didn't have many political rights, and they did not have any rights to political redress when they were committed, but neither did men at the time. So they were actually put in the same position as white men when they were committed. Now, could they draw on wider networks than other folks who would have been perhaps of lower class status? Yes. And since you brought up their racial identity, most asylums in the North did not admit people of color. And in fact, when they did, they had to live in separate or segregated quarters. And that's why in the South, you have institutions that are a product of segregation that only serve people of color.
Thank you.
Dr. Prince, Doris had a question. She's asking if you've researched anything about Caribbean, African slaves, Native Indians, Tanos, and any in their forced assimilation to Christianity.
I have, probably what I know most about from my research is the environment among enslaved peoples in the South and the efforts that were taken to convert people. I'm not sure, is there a specific question that you were curious about within that?
Actually, just how it affected also they became the marginalized even back then, the slaves and the Tainos and the Native American Indians, because they were of color. They were not, well, the Tainos and the Africans were not part of the states, and so they were indoctrinated into Christianity when they believed in more naturalistic, holistic ways of communing and spirituality, and then they were demonized for that. So they had to convert I'm sorry, I'm lost for words. The African religions and but the African religions, the saints or the icons, basically, in the religions they had to be transferred over to Catholic saints, and the celebrations, the dates, everything was transferred over so that they would not be demonized or killed as well.
All right, there's a lot to unpack in what you said. Thank you so much for sharing a couple of those currents of your thought. I would say to come back to this idea of mental health and religion among enslaved peoples in the South and the Caribbean more broadly, because of the prejudice, people of color were believed to be more naturally prone to insanity or madness than people of white persuasion. In fact, one of the ways that white slave owners demonized Black people was by referring to their religions not as religions, but instead as superstitions. And in this way, they saw their religions not as having the same rank as Christianity. And that encouraged some of them, although there was a lot of debate about whether or not it was wise to convert people who had been enslaved, because among those who had been among those who had adopted Christian identities and formed religious communities among the enslaved, those were actually incubators of enslaved resistance against white power at the time. So while there is this idea that they wanted them to be Christians, they really only wanted them to be nominally Christians. They didn't want them to gather together, and they didn't want them to read or have access to the Bible, because for anybody who has read the Hebrew scriptures, it's the story of the triumph of an enslaved people over a great empire. And that was very inspirational to many enslaved peoples, Africans and African Americans, in organizing their struggles to free themselves from bondage. So there's really a lot to say, to speak to in what you mentioned. But I think also you brought up the current of practices that combine both traditional African varieties of worship and practices that then combine those into Christianity. And I think the best example we have of that today is probably a practice like Santeria.
Correct. Thank you. Lukumi religion was then labeled Santeria when it traveled to Cuba.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I don't see any other questions in the chat. Anybody else have any questions?
Can I just ask one more real quick one? You mentioned the insane asylum in Utica. Is there any way to find out information about individuals that you may have run across? I do family research about why they were in the insane asylum, especially since it was during that time period that you were speaking of?
This is an interesting question. Thank you for raising it. One of the issues within the social study of madness is that records of people who were imprisoned in insane asylums or committed in insane asylums, those are medical records that are protected. So those are not open to public research unless you gain special permission as a researcher. And that can be, that's very much possible, but it's an arduous process because it's seen as a violation of their medical protection, of medical discretion. Now, an issue that is often brought up within MAD studies is that this protection of people's identities and their stories, the admittance records or other records relating to people who were admitted, let's say at Utica, this is actually premised on an idea that being committed is a negative thing, that having a mental illness or being mad is negative and that there's a stigma attached to it. And so we should somehow be hush hush, or we should be very careful with how we tell those stories. But in fact, in telling these stories, we come to a more full understanding of the lives of these people who were committed, not all of whom necessarily truly suffered, but many of whom were imprisoned against their will. And I would like to be clear, because I don't think I mentioned it in the beginning, that I don't in any way mean to suggest that everybody was not mad or crazy, or people didn't suffer from any effects that they encountered socially or through the doctrines of evangelical religion or other religions. Certainly many people have suffered, but then there's the other side of the coin, which is that there's this narrative of pathologizing them that actually doesn't represent their experience, and that's what I've been speaking to. So I also would say in your research, I can share my contact information, or maybe you can contact Jen and I can give you more information about that research. But that's why looking into public records of people who publish their own accounts. Now, certainly they had to be of a certain class status to do that, or there would be newspaper accounts, but then you're up against the challenge of sorting out what's the truth from the fiction of their actual lives.
Yes, certainly, Angelina, if you wanted to get in touch with me, I can give you Dr. Prince's contact information. Well, I think we are about out of time. I think we're out of questions as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Prince. That was very enlightening and just very interesting presentation, to say the least. I learned quite a bit. I did want to just share, we have some upcoming events at the CHS, and I wanted to just share those with those that are still with us. And just give me a moment here. Okay, just to mention very quickly, our next coffee hour is December 3rd. It'll be on Rosie the Riveter. And on Saturday the 4th, we have our next guided tour of our mental health exhibit, Common Struggle, Individual Experience, an exhibition about mental health. We are giving these tours, it's about a 45-minute tour of the exhibition periodically. in December and then coming into the new year, we do recommend that you visit our website and pre-register. We do have it capped at about 20 people per tour. And then we do have our next Lunch and Learn on the 7th, Accounting for Labor in Colonial Connecticut, which should be very interesting look at household economies and all of the dependents that are responsible for really making a household run. So that's what we have going on. And if you can find all of this information at our website, chs.org. And I want to just say thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. And thank you again
Yeah,
to
thank you.
Dr. Prince. Thank you.
Yeah,
We'll see
thank
you
you,
next time.
everybody.